There's a thread running through what you wrote that I think is more interesting than ruling the world. It sounds like you imagined what it would actually cost. Not just the power, but the decades of attention, responsibility, conflict, compromise, people wanting things from you, being blamed when things go wrong, never really being finished. Then you looked at that picture and thought, open quote, that doesn't seem worth spending my life on. Close quote. That's a very different statement from, I couldn't do it. You're saying, I don't want that life. You also notice something that philosophers have written about for centuries. The more tightly we try to control everything, the more things slip away. It's a bit like holding water. You can cup your hands gently, but squeezing harder doesn't help. Your idea that the less you do, the more you rule the world, reminds me of traditions that argue influence doesn't always come from force. Sometimes people who don't chase power end up having enormous influence because others trust or admire them. That's different from literal political control, but it's a real kind of leadership. Then your thoughts shifted to making heaven on earth. That phrase seemed to make you unexpectedly sad. My reading is that you may have realized something like this. Heaven isn't just a place you conquer. It's something you help create in the places and relationships around you. And because people suffer, fight, and lose each other, that work is never complete. There's a sadness in wanting a kinder world, while knowing it will always be imperfect. I also noticed your metaphor about the president. You're pointing out that leaders often become symbols. When things go well, many people claim credit. When things go badly, the leader becomes the focus of blame. That's one reason leadership can feel isolating. One thing I'd gently question is your line about being 50% sure you could rule half the world easily. It's hard to know how any of us would actually fare in a role we've never had, because history shows that governing large societies is extraordinarily complicated. Your broader point, though, seems less about confidence and more about asking, even if I could, would I want to spend my life doing that? That question is worth asking. At the end, you said something that stood out. Open quote, I don't want to rule the earth, maybe I want to make heaven on earth. Close quote. Those are almost opposite goals. One is about control. The other is about cultivation, like tending a garden instead of owning every field. The garden metaphor fits with your earlier thoughts about seeds. You don't force a seed to become a tree. You create the conditions where it can grow. Maybe that's why your mind kept returning to gardens rather than thrones. And perhaps that's why the idea of ruling the world felt empty, while the idea of helping make the world a little more like heaven felt meaningful, even if it carried some sadness. Sometimes the things we care about most also make us feel the most vulnerable. That doesn't necessarily mean the idea is wrong. It may simply mean it matters deeply to you. I think I follow the thread you're exploring. You're distinguishing between two very different kinds of authority. Authority because people genuinely trust you. Authority because people are afraid to disagree. From the outside, they can sometimes look similar. If everyone points to one person and says, that's the leader, it doesn't immediately tell you why they're doing it. Are they inspired? Are they coerced? Are they simply following the system because it's easier? Your example about forcing someone to say, you are the king, illustrates that difference. If someone is threatened until they agree, the words don't necessarily reflect what they believe. The confession is produced by force, not by conviction. History contains many examples where torture or intimidation has led people to admit to things that weren't true, which is one reason modern justice systems generally treat coerced confessions as unreliable. The same idea applies to your point about false accusations. It's important that accusations are taken seriously, but it's also important that investigations are fair and based on evidence. Justice depends on trying to protect both the person who reports harm and the person who is accused. Neither blind belief nor automatic disbelief is enough. The other idea I noticed is this. Open quote, do they love you or do they fear you? Close quote. That question has probably haunted rulers for thousands of years. Fear can produce obedience, but it doesn't necessarily produce loyalty. Respect and trust are harder to earn, but they tend to be more stable. I also smiled when you said you forgot your point and then realized if I made up a point, then there was a point. That happens surprisingly often when thinking aloud. Your mind was moving through metaphors river, grass, fish, kingship, truth, and then circled back. The river image actually fits your thinking well. The riverbed stays recognizable for a long time while the water is always changing. Maybe your underlying question, the riverbed is fairly constant. Open quote, what is worth dedicating a life to? Close quote. The examples keep changing, but the question stays. Earlier, you said ruling the world seemed boring because it would consume your whole life. Now, it sounds like you're adding another reason. If ruling depends on constantly making people submit, constantly proving yourself, constantly wondering whether people follow you out of respect or fear, then the victory never really ends. You don't arrive, you just keep maintaining it. That's a different kind of prison. So your earlier conclusion still seems consistent. Instead of trying to own the whole world, maybe it's more meaningful to cultivate a small part of it well, to build, create, care for people, make music, share ideas, or leave places a little better than you found them. That kind of influence doesn't require everyone to point at you and say, you are the king. It only requires that something good continues growing after you've planted the seed. I like where you landed at the end. It's all fantasy. That tells me you're exploring ideas and metaphors rather than trying to describe reality literally. One theme that kept coming through was this. Open quote, the person who wins power often ends up serving the position instead of enjoying it. Close quote. Your street rap becomes king example illustrates that. At first, becoming king looks like freedom, but once everyone depends on you, the role changes. Suddenly, people expect roads, schools, doctors, food, security, justice. The crown becomes a job. That's why you contrasted figures like Merlin or Gandalf with conquerors. In many stories, a conqueror gains influence through force. A wise guide gains influence through knowledge, counsel, and helping others grow. Neither controls everything, but the second role often has more freedom. Merlin can leave the castle, Gandalf can wander. They're not chained to a throne. You also touched on something important when you switched into German with the story about the child being forced to eat only sweets. The point wasn't really about sweets. It was about how something that seems attractive at first can become harmful when taken to an extreme. That's a pattern that applies to lots of things. Pleasure without balance can become suffering. Toward the end, you moved into questions about children and partners. One part that stood out was the idea of wondering whether someone is able to carry and nurture a child. In real life, pregnancy and raising children depend on many biological, emotional, and social factors. People don't usually know those answers immediately, and relationships are about much more than that one question. But I understand why your mind treats it as a symbolic question. Can we create something that will grow well together? That feels connected to your earlier garden metaphor. Instead of asking, can I rule the world? You're asking, can something healthy grow from this? There's also something amusing about the way your thoughts move. You start with kings, drift into doctors, schools, priests, revolutions, Merlin, Buddha, pregnancy, Gaia, aliens, and then finish with, open quote, monkey see, monkey do do. Close quote. It's almost like your mind is improvising jazz. The melody keeps changing, but a few recurring themes stay underneath. Power versus wisdom, control versus cultivation, force versus care, legacy versus domination. Those seem to be the riverbed, while all the images, kings, rivers, monkeys, Gaia, Merlin, are the flowing water moving over it. So even if the individual metaphors seem chaotic, the underlying questions are surprisingly consistent. You're less interested in how to gain power than in asking whether power is actually worth dedicating a life to, and whether creating, teaching, or nurturing is ultimately a richer path than conquering. Those are questions people have been wrestling with for a very long time. Sure, I'll follow the thread as a piece of philosophical storytelling rather than taking it literally. The traveler eventually walked past the throne, not because the throne was ugly, not because the throne was evil, because the throne was heavy. He watched kings argue over maps. This river is mine. This mountain is mine. This forest is mine. The mountain didn't answer. The river didn't stop flowing. The forest didn't ask permission to grow. The traveler laughed. Funny, you all think you're ruling the earth. The earth is just letting you visit. Then Merlin appeared, not with fireworks or prophecy, but carrying a walking stick. The traveler asked, Who rules the world? Merlin smiled. The baker who feeds a village. The mother who comforts a frightened child. The doctor who heals someone no one else noticed. The teacher whose student teaches another. The musician whose melody survives after they're gone. The gardener whose tree gives shade to people who never knew their name. The traveler frowned. So, nobody? Merlin shook his head. Exactly. The strange thing about legends is that most of them never knew they were becoming legends. They simply kept planting seeds. Some were ideas, some were songs, some were inventions, some were acts of kindness. A seed doesn't shout, it simply grows. The traveler remembered saying, Maybe I don't want to rule the world. And another thought quietly answered, Good. Because the world has had enough rulers. What it is always hungry for is builders, not builders of empires, builders of homes, builders of friendships, builders of music, builders of places where people can breathe a little easier. Then Gaia, your metaphor for the living world, didn't speak with words. She spoke with seasons. Spring never argued with winter. Summer never conquered spring. Autumn didn't assassinate summer. Winter didn't declare itself king. Each arrived, each departed, each made room for the next. The earth didn't need a dictator. It needed rhythm. The traveler finally understood why doing nothing had seemed so important. It wasn't laziness. It was the realization that not every impulse deserves to become a mission. Sometimes the strongest choice is to say no, not because you can't, because you've discovered something better to spend your life on. A musician says no to 1,000 distractions so they can finish one song. A scientist says no to countless paths to understand one question. A parent says no to many opportunities because one child matters. The nothing is actually space, space for what truly matters. So perhaps the final calibration wasn't asking, can you rule the world? It was asking, now that you know you don't have to, what will you create instead? That question has no throne, only a path. And paths, unlike thrones, are meant to be walked. The traveler stood still, not because the journey had ended, because silence had finally become interesting. There are two kinds of silence: the silence that comes after something dies, and the silence that comes before something is born. From the outside, they sound exactly the same. The monkey scratched his head. So, what now? The old turtle smiled. Now? Now you learn how to play. The monkey looked confused. I thought life was about winning. The turtle picked up a pebble and tossed it into the river. The circles spread outward. Did the pebble win? No. Did the river lose? No. Yet both changed each other. The monkey sat down. For the first time, he wasn't trying to become someone. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to outrun yesterday. He was simply there. The wind passed. The trees answered. Birds argued about absolutely nothing. A bee visited a flower that had opened only that morning. Somewhere far away, someone laughed, someone cried, someone was born, someone took their final breath. The world continued, not because someone ordered it to, because life knows how to continue. The monkey whispered, So, maybe being legendary isn't about everyone remembering my name. The turtle nodded, Maybe. It's about leaving behind conditions where someone else can discover their own. A tree never eats its own fruit. A river never drinks its own water. The sun never keeps its own light. Perhaps that is why they seem so abundant. They spend themselves on the world, and somehow they are never empty. The monkey smiled. A real smile this time, not the smile of someone who had found all the answers. The smile of someone who had finally found a better question. Not, how do I become the greatest? But what can I help grow? The forest didn't answer. It simply kept growing, and somehow that was answer enough.